still waking up. All right.
Okay. Hello and welcome to Our Professor Podcast. I'm Micah Sander.
I'm Carter Green.
Today, we talked with Professor Brigid O'Keeffe. Professor Brigid O'Keeffe is a historian of late imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. She received her BA from Ohio University and her PhD from NYU. She is the author of the Multiethnic Soviet Union and its Demise, Esperanto and Languages of Internationalism in Revolutionary Russia, and New Soviet Gypsies, Nationality, Performance, and Selfhood in the Early Soviet Union. She is currently at work on her next book, The Family Litvinov, A History of the 20th Century. We have today a student who has worked closely with Professor O'Keeffe. We have our editor-in-chief of our undergraduate student journal for the Historical Society, John. Welcome, John, to Our Professor Podcast.
Welcome.
Hey guys, nice to be here.
John, what is it like taking a class with Professor O'Keeffe?
I'm sure you guys will hear this a lot, but honestly, it's very eye-opening in terms of actually finding out about the lived experiences of Soviet people, just regular everyday people, and how they constantly adapted to their changing political realities. You get a lot of the human perspective on things, and not the typical perspective you would see mostly in textbooks. I would say in America or in American education systems. It's very, very eye-opening and refreshing to hear about the actual Soviet people and how they experience their own lives.
What sets her class apart? What are the things that makes her class unique, John?
Well, first, I would say definitely the passion she has for teaching the field, one, and two, I would say the way she sets up the class, it's not just organized sort of chronologically, but also thematically in a way that combines the experience of the regular Soviet people with the more, I would say, maybe concrete political realities they experience. So she does it in a way where she introduces the lives of the Soviet people. You get to know them intimately as well. So sometimes firsthand accounts of their lives, but also you get to know the political, the social, the even simply like the governmental things that were controlling them and how they sort of managed to get a hold of their own lives, how their agency was still there. So she teaches it in a way that the political sense of things makes sense along with the more intimate realities of the people.
Now, John, your favorite book is The Brothers Karamazov, correct?
No.
Read the script.
What's my line? What's my line?
But you've read The Brothers Karamazov.
Yeah.
What if I told you, John, that the book that set Professor O'Keeffe on her path into her field was The Brothers Karamazov?
I wouldn't be surprised, one, because it's such a good book, and I would say it's the best book ever written, or like at least one of.
But it's not your favorite.
But it's not your favorite
But
book.
it's not
Okay. Sorry, I misinterpreted that. When you told me it's the best book ever written, that's my mistake, I
Right.
guess.
No. There's a difference.
There's a difference. I say one of the best books, but honestly, because and I've heard this in a podcast, you can find every human being in the book, sort of every personality that's latent within sort of your close community in that book. You can open that book up, and I could find someone that represents my brother, someone that represents my father. Everybody is in there. So I really combining sort of the themes with the class, as I've been saying, the intimateness of the Soviet people, it makes sense as to why that book, especially given Dostoevsky's writing. Dostoevsky's just an amazing writer in general. He has a phenomenal way of like isolating sort of what makes humans human and putting that into words, which is just very hard to do through the physical sense, let alone the psychological sense.
Well, I think those are fantastic answers. I think we have a very special, longer episode of Our Professor Podcast today to have our conversation with Professor O'Keeffe. I say we should get right to it. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Brigid O'Keeffe. Thank you, Professor O'Keeffe, for being with us today. We're just going to start with, why did you choose your area of study? Did it change over time? And was there a particularly important professor or mentor at any stage of your education?
First, I want to say thank you to Micah and Carter. This is a really cool project that you guys have been working on, and it's a pleasure to talk to you and to geek out with you in a way that doesn't require me assigning homework to you. So it's fun to be here with you. In kind of classic O'Keeffe fashion, I have to tell you that I probably wouldn't be sitting here and talking with you two today if it were not for the fact that in an earlier lifetime, I was once a sullen, bookish teenager in Ohio. So my kind of trajectory to becoming a scholar of modern Russian and Soviet history on some levels always strikes people as maybe a little preposterous, but at the very least unexpected, because I obviously have what I myself will concede is a kind of, on the surface, like an Irish nationalist name, right? Like, how does someone named Brigid O'Keeffe become a scholar of imperial Russian and Soviet history? All right, so let's go back to me being a sullen, bookish teenager in Ohio, right? Who was curious and interested in the world, much like the history majors I encounter at Brooklyn College so often are. I really, really, really love reading fiction. First and foremost, what I love to read is fiction. And when I was in high school, it's been so many years since I read this book, but here's the origin story. I was reading Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five, and there is a character in that book, I'm paraphrasing, who says something along the lines of, all you need to know in life is in Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov. I was like 15. I took this literally. Right? So, and maybe I should have taken it literally. But in any event, it piqued my curiosity, right? And I was already like someone who was like super into reading books for fun and reading novels for fun. The bigger the novel, the more challenging a novel, the more fun it seemed to me. So I picked up Dostoevsky's Brothers Karamazov, and it kind of like blew my mind like to pieces and in a million different directions. To this day, like, I'm not exactly convinced that all you need to know in life is in that book, but it was enough, moment, like a moment when you're figuring out like where you might be in the world and who you might be, that it ignited my imagination in any event. So I just thought like, man, Russian literature is super interesting. When I go to college, right, like I really want to learn more about this. Now, here's the thing, right? I still to this day, more than anything, I love to read fiction. But something told me, like I told myself as a sullen, bookish teenager in Ohio, like when I go to college, I can't major in literature because I don't want to ruin it, right? Like I don't want it to become a job, right? It seemed kind of natural and intuitive that I major maybe in history instead, because I also loved history. I found it really interesting. It ignited my imagination in a parallel but different way. And being a history major also struck me as exciting because I love to write. And history is also about storytelling and narrative crafting. It is also craftsmanship. So it seemed to be a kind of natural fit. But to tie it together, right, I then go to college. I'm 18 years old. One of the first things I signed up for was Russian 101. And there was also, this was like pure serendipity, right? Like no matter what college you go to, or no matter how old or young you are in 2023, like everyone has to take like a writing composition class. So at my college that semester, this is pure serendipity. One of the English composition required courses was centered around one book. And that one book was The Brothers Karamazov. So I signed up for that. I got to geek out more on that, all of these things. And basically, while I was in college and I was, I took classes in all kinds of histories, but I really enjoyed my Russian history professor, who was an extraordinary lecturer. And also when I was a junior in college, this was in the year 2000, I had the opportunity to study abroad in Moscow. And I just enjoyed it so much. And it kind of cemented what I had already been feeling, which was that, I'd like to maybe make a life out of this, like not just like a hobby, but like I really love school. I really love learning, and wouldn't it be cool if I could maybe make a career out of being at the front of the classroom instead of in a seat in a classroom. And so I applied to PhD programs to take it further and to study Russian and Soviet history at an advanced level. So that's the origin story. I don't know. I mean, the joke I always add on to it is like, what would my life be had I read some like exciting Swedish novel or something else, right? But as it is, right, life is about, it's at least as much about coincidence or randomness than it is about plans or structure. But now, of course, the added irony is, right, like, as someone who loves books and who loves fiction, I sometimes reread books that I haven't revisited in a while. I need to revisit Kurt Vonnegut, but I think it was the summer after I completed my PhD program. I was like, oh, you know what I should do? I should reread The Brothers Karamazov. And I did, and I was like, what was I thinking? I didn't enjoy it. Like, you can still appreciate it, but I was like, what a crabby, kind of bleak, grim, like so many things about it were not exciting to me in a way that, but like we evolve too as people. But yeah, I mean, I could go on about how my like shifting allegiances in terms of classic Russian literature have evolved over the years, but that would probably be a whole nother boring podcast series that no one would ever in their right mind want to listen to.
We've all seen the depictions of the Soviet Union in shows and movies, and we have this kind of image in our head: gray, cold, unsmiling workers and automatons. Your work completely undoes all those stereotypes that we have of it, showing the Soviet people having fun. They have their own thoughts, and it actually does get warm in the Soviet Union. Oh, why is it seemingly so radical to undo all these narratives? How do you overcome this through your craft?
Look, I kind of take pride in the fact that I feel like if someone makes it through a full semester of Soviet history with me, if nothing else, right, I feel like they will walk away at least with a series or an argument, a case that has been made to them that the people of the Soviet Union lived lives in Technicolor rather than in grayscale, right? Like human beings tend to do all over the world, right? I mean, this is on a meta level, like my number one priority, right? And on some level, it's still somehow, even though I've been doing this for some time now, it still even to me can feel radical to do this, even though it's like my job. And on some level, this can also be frustrating. Like, how frustrating and in some ways sad that like it is radical to like have to make a big concerted pedagogical push, right? Like, we're studying real human beings, right? And that they deserve to be encountered and studied as such, as real human beings. Those moments of frustrations past, and as a historian, you remind yourself, right? It is radical, it remains necessary, because all of us in those classrooms, right? You, Micah, you, Carter, me also as the professor, we are also products of history and we're products of a culture. So by the time any student walks into my classroom at Brooklyn College wanting to know more or just needs to fulfill a requirement and thereby needs to learn more about Soviet history, right? You, as that student, have already gone through probably roughly at least 2 decades of imbibing a culture that presents a very flat stereotype, right? Which you very aptly described. Unsmiling, robot-like, disempowered, cogs in a totalitarian machine, right? And the landscape of the Soviet Union in your average person in North America's mind is gray, miserable, and very, very cold, right? But here's the deal, right? Like, what is the study of history at all, right? Whether it's the Soviet Union or early modern France or whatever the case may be, we're studying human beings, right? So in as much as in some ways it can seem a little bit like, dear Lord, how is it still necessary for me to do all of this deconstruction work? it's also really exciting, right? And I understand that it's so important, right? Like it's like the key to unlocking all of the other types of things that I want students to understand about Soviet history, right? Like that is the building block upon which all of those other arguments that on some level to me are still more exciting and are more interesting, right, rests. Because before we can get to those questions meaningfully, like I need to get everyone in the room at least with a mind open towards putting away some of the stereotypes that have a history, a long history of their own, and kind of looking at our primary sources and our historical subjects from this fresh perspective. I will say that when I was researching my second book, I had reason to read a lot of travel logs and guidebooks that were written by Americans and Brits in the 1920s and the 1930s, a time at which, for obvious reasons, right, people in the capitalist West were like agog and like curious about this new quote unquote Soviet experiment, right? And there were a lot of people who traveled from the United States and throughout Europe to the Soviet Union during these kind of pivotal years. And they made like a whole career. It was like almost obligatory that when you returned, you would write a travelogue or some type of guidebook. And those travelogues are almost to the last chock full of reproductions of these many of these same stereotypes that in fact predated the Cold War, where they really get kicked into overdrive and become embedded in our culture in this really concrete way. But one guidebook really stood out to me as being an outlier. And there was this moment in it where I was like, oh my God, if I were going to put like one little quote from a primary source on every syllabus, this is the one that I would choose, right? So this guy wrote, I offer then these random notes to help you to an understanding of the Soviet experiment. Number one, think of the people you see on the street, in the factories, and elsewhere, not as Bolsheviks, but as human beings with pretty much the same hopes, the same ambitions, feelings, and emotions as yourself, right? That is effectively, it encapsulated so beautifully. And like, I was so excited because it was such an outlier moment, right? Like that kind of first step that can then help all of us when we study Soviet history get to some of the still more interesting questions. Because of course, right, there is cultural specificity, right? The other thing that you two gentlemen know, because you've taken my classes before, is that, you know, another thing that I try to help students better understand is how and why Soviet people did understand the world in ways that might be radically different than how we understand them, right? But to be able to understand how people came to have different worldviews, right, we first have to accept and appreciate, and like in a really meaningful, substantive way, that human beings, all of us, right, live in color, have feelings, have emotions, have ambitions, but we're also products of our distinctive milieus, right? Cultural, social, economic, and certainly political too.
If I can tag on something to this question too, did you encounter these stereotypes in your education or even among colleagues still? I mean, do you still go to the conferences and see these kinds of things?
Without kind of throwing anyone under the bus, right? Like I had the same exposure, right? Like I'm a product of the Cold War. I am a product of American culture. Almost as a point of principle, I have not yet watched the classic 80s movie Red Dawn that I hear so much of, right? But I mean,
What?
you know, like I grew up in the American Midwest, right? I'm pummeled with the same stereotypical gray, cold, miserable automaton presentation that tends to kind of dominate in the American mindset. When I was an undergraduate, I was exposed more often than not to the traditional old school kind of totalitarian picture of Soviet history, in which ordinary people didn't play a huge, enormous role in terms of the analysis or the presentation. Or if they did, they were kind of presented in a very flat way as presumed victims rather than agents of a culture and a larger society or civilization of which they were part. Now, all of that being said, I was still like obviously super fascinated and interested in Soviet history and in Russian culture and history writ large, enough so that I went and applied to do doctoral study in this regard. But it was as a graduate student where I really, for the first time, got the fullest exposure to the possibilities on offer in what at the time was like a really revived historiography, where those old narratives were already kind of like being more so as a norm rather than an exception challenged, right? So I kind of like was a graduate student in what some ways was a kind of golden age for rethinking and reimagining how we talk about, how we ask questions of, how we teach Russian and Soviet history. So I had several mentors in graduate school, of course, but I had three mentors in graduate school who really helped me not only to be exposed to this historiography, but who also helped me become the historian and the teacher I am today in other ways, right? So my primary advisor in graduate school is a scholar named Yanni Katsonis. His most recent book is a study of taxation in imperial Russia. And so you might be like, how did O'Keeffe end up studying that, right? Now, the reason why it actually makes sense is Yanni Katsonis is someone who taught me many things, but one of the things that he taught me from the get-go was, on some level as a historian, right? Like the specific topic that you're studying and you're writing about in and of itself isn't the main thing, right? Like it isn't the main story. I might write about taxation, you might write about Roma or Esperanto or whatever the case may be. Where history really comes alive, or where its real potential lies, is in the questions you ask of that subject, right? That particular research focus of the moment, right? Like where really the magic happens is in how you craft your question and how you craft your approach. My other major advisor in graduate school is a historian named Jane Burbank, who's not just an amazing historian of imperial Russia, but she's also been at the forefront of what scholars call this new imperial history, which for you guys, right, is kind of like the norm. It's the water you've been swimming in as undergraduate history majors. But is that like, in the relative sense of the things, a kind of more recent push in the wider discipline of history to think about empires, to think about imperial repertoires, agents of empire, and like the dynamic relations that adhere to different imperial circumstances. And she's also someone who's been like really instrumental in writing about histories in a comparative sense, right? Like in the most productive way. When you compare two empires, you can appreciate both what makes one exceptional or singular, but you can also see parallels and similarities in a productive way. These types of things also help to cut against those flattened stereotypes of Russia and the Soviet Union that I'm otherwise always trying to work against as well, right? Because if you don't kind of siphon off or segregate the study of imperial Russia or the Soviet Union to this like exotic side world, but instead look at it within a wider frame of comparative empires or modern world history, it becomes clear actually pretty quickly, right? Like that late imperial Russia and the Soviet Union are not so exotic, right? That they're actually kind of familiar, right? And that there are kind of commonalities that in some ways have been hiding in plain sight before us all this time, but that we have been blinded from seeing because, again, as products of our own history, our own time, and our own culture, right? Like we kind of basically enter the world as Americans told that there is nothing shared between these civilizations.
As alluded to already, both Carter and I have had the pleasure of taking class with you, particularly the Soviet Union as a multi-ethnic empire, which completely changed our perspective on Soviet history. The themes from that course are the focus of your latest book, The Multiethnic Soviet Union and Its Demise. As the title points to, you connect the Soviet Union's ethnicity policies and ideologies to its fracturing along national lines in 1991. But beyond that, you write that this book, quote, seeks to show how ethnic diversity was central to how Soviet citizens variously experienced life and death, renewal and collapse, revolution and stasis, the extraordinary and the banal between the years 1917 and 1991, unquote. How does understanding the Soviet Union's ethnic diversity help us better grasp the complexity of Soviet society?
Awesome. Super excited to tackle this question, at least in miniature, right? This has been like this is also a huge priority in my life as a scholar, but also as a teacher, right? Speaking of things that are hiding in plain sight, right? And speaking too of how we're blinded by like all of these lenses that have obscured more than they revealed, right? Micah, we've talked about this more so in a different class that you took with me last semester on the study of Stalinism, right? But like, if you think about how your average, even well-educated American talks about the Soviet Union, what they'll usually say is not like, oh, the Soviet people, they'll say the Russians, right? Like the Russians, the Russians, the Russians. Now, the Soviet Union, this is too complicated for us to go in here, but the Soviet Union is at least in part responsible for part of this conflation, right? But in the American mindset too, right? North American, even in Europe, right? Like there's in the kind of generic imagination of the Soviet Union, it's the Russians. And Russia and the Soviet Union were frequently used interchangeably. Oh, this does so much erasure of the overwhelming ethnic, linguistic, cultural, and even religious diversity that was unavoidable and inescapable when we're talking about the history of the Russian Empire, past and present, and certainly the Soviet Union, right? So, just as a kind of like short introduction, right? The first time that the Tsarist Empire conducted what historians would call a modern census was 1897. Now, they didn't count in terms of nationality or ethnicity because they were still like not sure of how they felt about those terms and how much they wanted to do with them. But they were nonetheless trying to ascertain, right, like the extent and the degree to which they themselves were abundantly aware of in terms of the immense ethnic diversity all across this enormous empire. So the question that they asked instead was, what is your native language? And even by those kind of faulty terms, right? The 1897 census of the Tsarist Russian Empire revealed that so-called ethnic Russians were in no way, shape, or form in the majority in this large empire. If you jump ahead after the revolution to like the first major Soviet census, this comes about in 1926. The question was asked, who are you by nationality? And what the Soviet Union found was that there were nearly 200 conceivable, reliable, semi-consistent answers to those questions, right? No matter how much you count, no matter how much you subtract, and certainly these things are all kind of very complex, but whether we're talking about late imperial Russia or the Soviet Union, we're talking about a people and a culture and a society that was populated with people who were of all different cultural and linguistic backgrounds, and that quote unquote ethnic Russians never, even by like fudging it, right? Like, or trying to argue their way against a reality, ethnic Russians were never in the majority, right? So there's the first instance, like the huge fact of the diversity that needs to be accounted for and reckoned with and appreciated, which is usually a revelation, right? Like when I'm just having a random conversation with someone, this is a total revelation. I never knew, right? Like I thought this was a very homogenous place, right? Maybe some Ukrainians, maybe some Belarusians, but it's a Russian place, right? So on the one level, it's a revelation, but it's historically important and it's historically central for another reason. The architects of the new Soviet state, right? The men, and they were almost all of them men, who were running the show and who were trying to kickstart a Marxist-inspired socialist revolution amidst the rubble of the Tsarist Empire in 1917, understood one thing as being, right, a top line item number on their agenda that they could not avoid and that they had to find some smart way of dealing with. And that was the fact that they were going to try and need to find some way of unifying a population that was not only differentiated by class terms, right, which as Marxists is their number one interest, but that was fundamentally disunited and fractured by all of these differences, ethnic differences, linguistic differences, certainly religious differences too. And this was, you know, an internationalist socialist revolution attempted in an age of militant nationalism. And so one thing the Bolsheviks understood from the start was, if we have any hope at all of pulling this off, right, this major socialist, unparalleled, never tried before revolution, in this place, in this time, with all the obstacles we face, we need to find some way in the near short term of preventing nationalist breakaways. We need to somehow get all of these different ethnic groups to sign on, right? And to not just like sign on grudgingly, right? But to like feel motivated to co-sign, right? And to help build this revolution and all of these things. So one of the first things that the Bolsheviks actually do when they're trying to build this revolution and build this socialist state under extraordinarily wild circumstances is they create what we call kind of generically a nationality policy that was meant to appeal to the non-Russian peoples of the Soviet Union. And as I explore in the book and in the course that the two of you took in last year, right, this recognition and this approach to governing, to mobilizing, to managing in the crudest form ethnic diversity within Soviet borders was not just a foundation of the revolution from the get-go, but it had enormous consequences for the way the revolution played out and shape-shifted and it evolved. And because these things don't happen in the abstract, but happen to real people, right, who live real lives in these spaces, in these empires, in these large countries, in these revolutions, it had enormous but often varying consequences for the different peoples of the Soviet Union who identified as Russian, as Ukrainian, as Chukchi, as Uzbek, as Kazakh, as Kyrgyz, right? Like if I was going to try to list all of the different ethnicities that were recognized by the Soviet state, we would go on much too long, right? But it's a kind of, it was understood even by the Bolsheviks themselves to be a kind of dizzying mosaic of a fundamental, unavoidable, and like huge ethnic difference. Now, I will say, one of the reasons why I was prompted to go to the effort to create a whole separate course offering, right, and the Brooklyn College curriculum that looked explicitly at the Soviet Union as a multi-ethnic empire, as I call it, it was because not only am I like someone who's always been interested in these questions, they've kind of been there in all of the different research projects I've undertaken so far, but it also came from like a place of sincere frustration and also like a sense of like failure, even though I knew that the failures I felt so guilty about were like products outside of my control. But what am I talking about? So Soviet history, as it is typically taught all across this country, is typically taught as Russian history. And I mean that not in like the like loosey-goosey, what different word are you using? Well, how does it matter? I mean it in the real way. Soviet history is typically taught as ethnic Russian history. It's primarily taught as something that happens in Moscow and in Leningrad, right? Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's typically a story that centers a presumed ethnic Russian-speaking Orthodox Christian experience. And so what that means is Russian history, Soviet history, as it traditionally is taught, presents, right, like the guise or the picture of giving you the whole, when really it's only giving you a narrow slice. So when I first started teaching at the college level, right, I was like also teaching my different Russian history courses, and I would try so hard, like, we're gonna at least spend a week talking about ethnic diversity, right? Now, a week is better than nothing, but it's problematic, right? For all kinds of reasons, right? It's like the same thing of like, I'm going to teach a whole semester on modern France, and maybe we'll spend a day talking about women, right? Like it's like giving something that is central, right? Like to the human experience, right? Like one little token moment or one little token concern, right? You see these problematic dynamics playing out in old school textbooks too, but also new school ones, right? Like new school textbooks try to kind of solve this problem by like giving things the sidebar treatment, right? You get like a whole chapter on the Industrial Revolution, and at the end, before the discussion questions, there'll be like a page in a different color with an image of women, and it'll be like, how did the ladies experience the Industrial Revolution, right? Like, oh, doesn't cut it, right? Like it doesn't cut it. It doesn't unpack, it doesn't problematize the problem with the core narrative that universalizes something that is in fact distinct. In any event, you know, for all of these reasons, I was like, it's just not enough to like try and hastily in 1 week and in this like totally unsatisfying fashion try to add on to this other class, like a week of considering ethnic diversity, right? Like this is so central to not only how the Soviet Union was created, to how the Soviet Union falls apart, again, along national lines, very famously in 1991, but it's absolutely central to how ordinary people experience Soviet life. And so it at the very least needs at least one of its own courses. So that's why I created the class, and then the class kind of inspired me to write the book, to be perfectly honest.
Mike and I have taken your class before, so we already know the 311. We know how it goes down. But for anybody that is a prospective student, what can they expect class wise, reading wise, work wise? What would they expect?
I think they can expect a few things that should be obvious if someone's listening to this right now. They can expect loudness. They can expect enthusiasm. I'm very insanely passionate about what I study, and I'm really excited to talk about it. I'm always really excited to see light bulbs go off in a classroom. I'm always super excited to hear students kind of coming to realizations in real time aloud during a class discussion. But as you two also know, I'm also someone who believes in the importance and in the power of the written word. So I am also very famous for assigning a certain little kind of assignment called a reading response, which might be painful in the moment, but that reaps huge dividends, right? Not just in terms of developing writing skills, but it's a way of refining and coming terms with how it is you feel or think about, or what you're confused about in terms of what we're talking about or reading about in a class. I mean, different classes that I offer have different goals. They have different setups, right? Like a colloquium class should look and should sound a little different than a 3000 level class. But I think that in any of the different classes that I teach, there are a few things that I feel like are essential. One is enthusiasm for the subject and enthusiasm for the encounter, right, of all of us coming together and working through ideas and questions together. I think the other thing that is really essential and that I try to maintain is a healthy sense of humor about life, right? We deserve to laugh and be serious in at least equal measure, and that history is joyful, really, even when we're talking about things that can be painful and grim or confusing. So I do try to keep humor as a priority in my classroom as well. If we go back to the first question that you asked me, and we were talking about how I say if there's one thing I want to make sure students walk away from, it's an understanding that the people we've studied in my class lived in Technicolor and not in grayscale. In order for me to effectively actually succeed in that goal, I have to provide students outlets to appreciate that Technicolor, right? So that means traditional readings, right? A traditional primary source written text, right? But thankfully, as a scholar of Soviet history, there's a world of kind of visual imagery that can also be, at least if not more, kind of exciting and dynamic for us to explore together in a classroom than a written text. And so we have that going. But in general, I just try to think of it as an opportunity for a meaningful and substantive, but ultimately, hopefully, at least mostly joyful experience where we can have a little fun, but also think through big topics, big debates, and even heady and sometimes terribly depressing concerns together.
We focus on these individual stories in your class, but you always weave together the big picture, the macro, and the closer look at these individual stories, the micro. You weave them together very well. But your main interest is in the micro and the lives of quote unquote ordinary people. When writing about microhistory, is it necessary to connect these zoomed in stories back to the bigger picture, or is the value of this history purely in learning about another human's experience of their time and place? Basically, can the ordinary be extraordinary without needing some more grand overarching narrative?
So I think that I'm a humanist, guys. I think that knowing about people's stories and just the dynamics of an ordinary life or an extraordinary life is of inherent value on its own. What I love about microhistory as a kind of distinct genre, as a methodology, as an approach, right, as an avenue towards thinking about or writing about or telling history, explaining history in a certain way, is that it holds that idea as its fundamental value, right? like, in fact, microhistory in its larger tradition, right, began primarily as like the more obscure, the more silenced, the more unnoticed in history, like the more ripe the opportunity. Now, right, microhistory, and I'm not mad about it, but now microhistory is just like any time you use the mode of zeroing in like on a singular example or a singular life or a singular commodity or whatever the case may be. But when it had its like origins as a distinct approach, it tended to be first pursued by people who were looking at lives of people who typically were completely discounted and left out of historical narratives, right? Anyway, I think that microhistory holds as a fundamental value that any life, any example, any person is worth knowing about. But what I like especially about microhistory is that it also holds that that's not enough, right? Like in the very process of making sense of that ordinary life, that singular event, that phenomenon, or that commodity, right? To actually do the real work of history requires doing the work of interpretation, of tying it to larger concerns, right? Just in the process of doing that historicism, that contextualization, almost by default, right? You come away with an interpretation. Now, it should happen by default if you're really doing microhistory as a microhistory. But I love that microhistory as a distinct genre kind of wears on its sleeve the idea that any individual's life can be made to speak meaningfully to larger questions and larger concerns, right? This ordinary life is interesting, is worth knowing about on its own, but it can also help us to understand that it is exemplary, right? Like that it reflects something about its time, its space, its context, or that it's exceptional, that it represents kind of an outlying position from the norm of the milieu from which it is placed. Or alternatively, that it's both of those things, right? Like that a person's life can be both exemplary or standard and extraordinary and special and singular at one and the same time. Now, I do teach History 2001, by the way, and I love it. It's one of my favorite classes. It might be my favorite class to teach, to be honest, but History 2001 is the historian's craft, right? Like this essential foundation course of the major. And one of my big pleas in that class, because I don't get to make it all about Soviet people, obviously, one of my pleas in that class is to understand that doing history isn't just something that happens by default anytime you talk about something that happened in the past, right? Like doing history is an art form, right? It's also a craft that underlying it are a whole set of kind of philosophical principles and a variety of potential methodologies that can be used, right? But one of the fundamental principles of history is that we're not just listing off dates, times, names, right? This isn't Jeopardy. God bless. Like Jeopardy's great, but that's not what we're doing, right? That history is in the service of not just knowing, it's in the service of understanding. And to understand, you need to put those facts, those dates, those names in their context, which requires interpretation, right? So a student once asked me in History 2001, when we were talking about microhistory, like, okay, O'Keeffe, but like, is this just like a fancy word for biography, right? Like, or is this just like a fancy word for a case study? And it was such a great question. It's an excellent question. It's the kind of question that, again, helps you to appreciate what actually is special about microhistory. A lot of people in the world write biographies, and some of them are good and some of them are bad. The worst ones tend to be written by people who don't actually appreciate history as something in the service of not just knowing, but of understanding, right? Of connecting things to larger dynamics and larger questions and larger concerns. The type of biography that like I will never want to read and that I'm always angry when I have to read is the type of biography that says like, and on this day, so-and-so was born, and then this happened, and then that happened, and then this happened, and then this happened. And somehow 350 pages, it's just like this happened, this happened, this happened, and this happened, and this happened. I'm a historian, so that's not enough, right? Like that's not enough, right? Like help me to understand what this person's life and how it evolved, how it can help me better appreciate these larger questions and these larger concerns. So I think that is why microhistory is so appealing to me and what I love to read, right? Because it does recognize that any story is a story potentially worth telling, but its purpose is to take an individual, a micro story, and make it speak to larger questions.
I assume that you've been asked many, 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 many times for your perspective about the Russia war on Ukraine, that today is actually day 400 of it on the dot, and it's made your line of work pretty relevant. Personally, how's the war impacted your research and the discussions that you have about your work?
Yeah, so it's been a heartbreaking 400 days. That's to say the very least. And you know, it's also been like an inescapable prompt to kind of have searching conversations that ask big questions for which it probably doesn't make sense to have immediate answers to, right? But like there have been other kind of big moments in my field that came as a big shock, right? When the Soviet Union collapsed, right? Even while it was collapsing, most people in the West were like, no, right? Like, no, right? And, from hindsight, it's like, oh, how did ever anyone not figure it out, right? But like, most people in my field will tell you when the full scale invasion started last year that it came as a shock. It shouldn't have come as a shock to any of us, and it did, right? Like, Putin had already invaded Ukraine in 2014, right? He had illegally annexed territories. This war didn't begin in 2022, right? What the difference is the full-scale invasion and the attempt so far, failed attempt to take over and to conquer Ukraine as a whole, right? But that requires some deep soul searching on some level, but it's some other questions that demand deep soul searching that are, for me, maybe more urgent and more interesting. One thing that scholars in my field have been agonizing about for the past 400 days is what now some people are suddenly coming to terms with, a notion that we must urgently decolonize our field. Right. In fact, when in November I attend my professional organization's annual conference, right, where all of us scholars, specialists, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, political scientists who study the region will come together, the theme for our annual conference in November is decolonization. Now, some of these conversations have already started over the last 400 days, and I don't second guess the earnestness of many of the kind of more vocal participants in these scattershot conversations. But so far, I've been left feeling very frustrated by them, right? And I've been feeling very frustrated by them in the sense that decolonization seems to mostly be deployed in this specific disciplinary context in the same ultimately frustrating way that it is often being deployed in the larger scholarly context, right? It's kind of like operating as this buzzword, not quite defined. Maybe we're all using it in different ways, in which case we have to figure out what way we want to be using it, right? But as a concept, it seems in the moment to have a limited value because it's primarily being thrown around in every direction in this buzzwordy fashion that can feel very empty and not meaningful, right? Like, for example, I think that a lot of my colleagues who have been pushing just over the last 400 days, like we must all of a sudden figure out how to decolonize the field. They're coming at it from the same perspective that I was already coming at this, right, prior to 2022. This doesn't make me a saint, by the way. It doesn't make me special, right? It doesn't make me singular, right? But like what they're essentially saying is we shouldn't be teaching Russian and Soviet history as ethnic Russian history. And we shouldn't be reproducing the type of nationalist narratives that only help to underscore and undergird, right, a kind of Russian sense of grievance and revanchism, right, in the present day that helps to explain, at least in part, this full-scale assault on the independent nation state of Ukraine. So there are a couple of things happening, but of course, right, this is all par for the course. This is how it should be. Like, we make progress by working through uncertainties and problems and debates. But so far, I think decolonization as a concept isn't quite working for the goals that I share with my colleagues. Because a lot of times it sounds to me like they're saying we need to decenter ethnic Russianness. But I think something that is needed and actually urgent, and something that I myself haven't done enough work in my teaching, is to think about decolonization in this historical context in a different way. Now, it has long been a problem in my field that like Russia and the Soviet Union is somehow kept outside or tangential to larger world history types of narratives or conversations or debates or courses, right? If you think about world history in terms of the 20th century, a major theme is decolonization, and rightly so. And not decolonization in the curricular sense, decolonization as a real historical phenomenon, right? The collapse, the disemboweling, the taking apart of empires is a huge phenomenon of the 20th century, and particularly after World War II. Now, in world history, decolonization, we've primarily been looking at the dismantling of overseas European empires, the British Empire, the French Empire, et cetera, et cetera. Maybe sometimes we might even get a little rowdy and talk about the United States as a modern empire, right? But Russia and the Soviet Union don't seem to play a role in these conversations. And that's curious. And it's also wrong, right? Like the story, right? The horrors and the heartbreak of this war, it's part of the story of decolonization, right? It is part of the story of the collapse of the Soviet Union, which didn't just happen in 1991 and end of story, right? I mean, to understand Putin's perspective, to understand why any of this happens, right, requires actually understanding not just 1991 and its aftermath, the collapse of the Soviet Union, as part of a larger, really kind of agonized process of decolonization. Should we be surprised that it seems kind of belated or that it's so agonized, or we're talking about a process that is several decades in the making? No, because if you study the dismantling of the British Empire, the Portuguese Empire, the French Empire, we also know that it's not just like people turned off the lights one day and the story is over, right? But I think that this is one of these ways where, again, something hiding in plain sight that we could do a lot more conceptual work with, but also kind of philosophical search with as a field in a productive way to think about how we might do and achieve and strive for what most people share in the current moment as like an urgently felt need, right? Like to decenter Russia in our study of this large and varied region that we're all kind of committed to. I mean, on a personal level, right? Like, don't shed any tears for me. Like, I'm not getting bombed. I'm not being conscripted. So I absolutely understand that. But I mean, on a very personal level, since you asked it, I mean, it's a total unabashed heartbreak, right? I mean, you asked me too, like, what does this mean for your research? I had plane tickets to go to Russia in April of 2020 to go to the archives that I love, right? That I spent so much time in, right? Obviously, I didn't get to take that trip because of the pandemic. I was supposed to go to the Russian archives twice in 2020, and that didn't happen. And you know, I'm someone who's kind of like geeked out for the entirety of her adult life, the study of the Soviet past, and I now face the reality like I might never see my Russian friends face to face. You know, last spring when the images came out of the Russian military's massacre of civilians in Bucha, right? I mean, it was a moment. I was just like, it has been hard ever since to imagine wanting to go back to Russia. I'm disgusted, right? Like, how could you not be, right? You know, it is complicated in this way, right? Like Soviet history, being a historian helps, right? Like time changes things, right? And there's also an appreciation that I try to impart or try to get students to appreciate in my classes, right? Like ordinary people aren't the same thing as a regime necessarily, right? But yeah, it's not it's just horrifying and heartbreaking in equal measure. My sympathies first obviously unquestionably lie with Ukraine and Ukrainian people. But I think that there is also room to reflect as a scholar, but as a human being, and to think with a kind of just wow, like awe at how much Russia is destroying itself too, right? Like I teach Soviet history and I teach the Cold War, right? And I have to talk to students about a time at which, right, like the Soviet Union enjoyed a pretty decent actual reputation with the people of the colonized or decolonizing world, but that enjoyed a terrible relationship with much of the West, right? But if you compare, right, like I don't think Russia has throughout world history earned such a poor reputation as it has now, right? And it's going to be, if ever the opportunity arises, it's going to be a hard crawl out from that hole, right? Like, who in 2023 is going to, with a straight face and a clear heart and a reasonable mind, right, like defend? I know there are people, right? I know there's like a rogues gallery, right? But let's be honest about it. Like this is an absolutely illegal, criminal, and genocidal war that did not need to happen and does not need to be happening.
There's your new book, but is there any other current work that you're looking forward to? New classes, ongoing research, a new project that you have coming?
I have a few things in my cauldron, but the book that I've been really excited about I've never been more excited to write a book is a project I've been working about and that I am like very close to being finished with my archival research about is a book project I've been calling The Family Litvinov, a history of the 20th century. So we spoke at length already about microhistory, so you can kind of guess where it's going. But I want to write about a particular family that is both singular and exceptional and also exemplary and ordinary, but in my mind, compelling in any conceivable, in all the fundamental human ways. And I want to look at them as a way to think about kind of like major dynamics that we can associate with the 20th century, or at the very least, the Soviet century. And it centers around, at its heart, what begins with the love story between a couple of Maxim and Ivy Litvinov. Maxim is famous somewhat. He should be famous. He was the Commissar of Foreign Affairs for the Soviet Union in a pretty important decade, the 1930s. He was also the Soviet Union's wartime ambassador to the United States from late 1941 through 1943. And he was married actually to a British woman who was a novelist who didn't speak Russian fluently and who was not a socialist, let alone a Marxist or a Bolshevik. And so it's kind of it's like a fascinating story in and of its own right. But what I want to do with this microhistory is what I think microhistory does so well, which is you get to delight in all of the fascination or what makes the story compelling, but also use it as a vehicle to probe these larger considerations. So that's a project I've been working on for a while and that makes my heart beat very fast and with excitement.
I have the final 5 fast questions. Are you ready for the 5 questions?
I'm ready.
All right. Favorite book?
I don't have a favorite book, but I knew you were going to ask me this question, so I came prepared. I have a recommendation. It's impossible to have a favorite book. But someone whose books and whose writing generally I absolutely love, I live for, I look forward to, is someone, a contemporary novelist, but also cultural critic named Patricia Lockwood. So her most recent book is called No One Is Talking About This. It will make you cry with laughter, and then it will make you cry like all of your heart is being ripped out. And she also wrote before that a memoir that is hilarious and smart called Priest Daddy. And she also regularly contributes to the London Review of Books. I never thought that someone like could make literary criticism fun, but she does. So Patricia Lockwood, check her out if you don't know who she is.
What is your favorite food?
Well, I love carbs. So I'll choose a group. But if like I'm gonna go to a restaurant or order in Thai food, I love Thai food.
What is your favorite non-work activity to do?
Riding my bike. I love riding my bike. Yeah.
What is your favorite thing to do in New York City specifically?
Museums. I mean, look, it's easy to take them for granted, but like how great, right? Like it's so easy to take them for granted living here. But yeah, museums. And that's also like what I like to do when I go to other cities too. Art museums especially.
And final question, your favorite genre of music?
Uh, well, I think if Spotify was gonna name it, it would probably end up being like indie lady vibes. I don't know. Like, I think Spotify has told me that like the people that I play like way too much on repeat are Phoebe Bridgers, Julian Baker. I'm a fan of like adult Taylor Swift, like recent Taylor Swift. But I also like love the old classics. Like the past couple months I've been revisiting a lot of Depeche Mode, but I think that that's probably how Spotify would define me.
Professor O'Keeffe, this was phenomenal. This was such an amazing interview. Thank you for
Amazing.
answering all of our questions. Yeah.
Thanks for doing this. It was a lot of fun talking to you, as always.
Our Professor podcast was recorded with the permission of the Brooklyn College History Department and our student interviewees. We would like to thank both the students and faculty for their contributions.